Awesome. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar on the Northern Lights. We have a lot of interest in this. We're going to try to break the internet today and see what we can do. But we really appreciate everybody joining us for it's the 144th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. So I'd like to welcome Jesse and Travis. Thank you, both of you, so much for joining us for this presentation. Jesse, we're going to start off with you, so I'm going to pass it over to you and let you introduce yourself a little bit. And then after that, we'll jump over to Travis to talk about the photography side of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jesse. I'm the education specialist at Voyageurs Conservancy, which is the official nonprofit partner for Voyageurs National Park. So my specialty, I work with students and with the public with the focus on preservation. Yep, Travis, if you'd like to introduce yourself, the floor is all yours.
Oh, okay. I was waiting for your presentation to start.
Oh,
Sorry. Yeah,
sorry about
Bonjour.
that.
Yeah, okay. Bonjour, Travis, Indigenous, Makwa, and Dudem, Kichionegaming, and Dunjaba. Hi, everyone. My name is Travis. I am Bear Clan, and I am from Grand Portage. I've been a photographer for most of my life, which, has been probably about 35 to 40 years now since I've been playing with cameras. So been shooting Northern Lights for close to 25 years. I'll share the rest of my stuff later. Thanks.
All right, great. Am I ready to start my presentation? Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, everything looks great. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, well, thanks again for coming. This is really exciting. Again, my name is Jesse. I work for the Voyageurs Conservancy, and today I'm here to talk a little bit about the Northern Lights and some of the science behind it. That is, what they are and why we can see them, how they form. So just a really quick little background on myself. I actually started off my experience in the National Park Service, and it was here where I started to learn about science communication and nature preservation. And that's also where I got my foot in the door to just absolutely fall in love with the night sky. It's where I learned about night sky preservation because that was a new concept to me when I first entered. And since joining the Park Service, I learned how to use the telescopes. I learned my constellations, and I've attended many star parties across the country, and have even helped to design my own star parties for the parks and organizations in which I've worked. So eventually, I ended up in this park way up here known as Voyageurs National Park. For those of you that don't know, it's in the northern end of Minnesota. And what we're known for a lot of things, but a lot of it is getting out on the water, whether it's on a tour boat or a houseboat or canoeing or kayaking. We have wonderful camping, and of course, we have fantastic night skies. And then eventually down the line, I found the Voyageurs Conservancy, which is again the official nonprofit partner for Voyageurs National Park. And our mission is to connect people to the park, enhance the visitor experience, and to protect the park for present but also future generations. Now, what that means, we protect and preserve the park in many different ways, but as the education specialist, specifically, what that looks like is I work with school groups and I work with the public, hands-on activities with a focus on preservation. So with that out of the way, we're here to talk about the Northern Lights. What I've presented on this slide is just kind of a snapshot of where we will be going throughout this talk, just so you know how we'll be navigating through all of it, because we have a lot of things to go through, but I'm sure by the end of this presentation, you'll have a well-rounded understanding of this beautiful phenomenon that we call the Northern Lights. So for the first one, very simply, what are the Northern Lights? Over here, I've kind of just copied and pasted a dictionary definition that you can read if you'd like, but very simply, it's just a beautiful phenomenon of lights shining across the sky. And what we'll see, I have a montage of pictures here. These were all taken at Voyageurs National Park. And what I really like to demonstrate with these pictures is the true diversity of types and styles of northern lights. Sometimes they are kind of wispy and dim and don't have a lot of bright color. Sometimes it's like somebody turned up the vibrancy all the way to the max. Sometimes it's just a big solid brick that doesn't move at all. And then sometimes we see a variety of different colors from greens and whites and purples and reds. And so we can see that the northern lights come in a variety of different styles and colors. But you might be asking yourself, this is the number one question I get is how do they form? That is, how are you looking at a nice, beautiful, starry sky like we see in this picture to all of a sudden seeing one that is vibrant and filled with moving colors? Well, for that, we're going to move on to how do the northern lights form? So, how do they form? Really, there's three things you need to remember. If you can remember these three things, you can pretty much answer this question. So, the three things you need to form the northern lights is one, you need to have an atmosphere filled with molecules. Two, you need to have a magnetic field that surrounds your planet. And three, you need to have violent explosions coming off of the sun. When those three interact, you get northern lights. So let's dive into each one of those three to see what that really means. The first one is Earth has an atmosphere. It's an atmosphere that extends up into space, and it's a blanket of molecules that surrounds our planet. Now, this is something that's sometimes a little bit tricky for us to think about. A lot of times we think that the air is emptiness. You know, for example, when I move my hand across like this, it's not bumping into anything or nothing stopping it. So it's easy to think that there's nothing there. But the truth is, our atmosphere is filled with stuff. It is filled with molecules, little tiny particles that we can't see, mostly in the form of nitrogen, also a big chunk of oxygen. So when I move around, I'm actually pushing through tons of material of nitrogen and oxygen. Okay, so remember that. That's the first step. Is Earth has an atmosphere filled with stuff. The second thing you need to remember that Earth has a magnetic field, has this wonderful kind of protective force field that surrounds the planet. And to understand why we have that, we have to look deep, deep, deep down into the layers of Earth, and we'll be met with this area known as the outer core and the inner core. If you were to look at the material of the outer and the inner core, you'll notice respectively it's liquid and solid metal. And due to really complicated interactions and due to the extreme heat and the extreme pressure and the turning and the churning and the actual composition of this material, it actually generates magnetism. And this magnetism shoots out of the poles and it wonderfully surrounds our planet. It's invisible to our eyes, but this giant magnetic field is very real and very present. And the third step, we're going to put it all together in just a moment, but the third step is we need to direct our attention to the sun. The wonderful, beautiful sun. We associate it, with watching beautiful sunsets on a nice summer day. I love the sun, but it's also important to remember while the sun is beautiful in many ways, it is also a chaotic and violent, powerful force to be reckoned with. Every single second that the sun continues to burn, it releases explosions, letting off more energy than every nuclear weapon on Earth put together. Every second, it's just naturally doing that. And the thing is, this was a big surprise to me when I started to learn about the Northern Lights, is that the sun is actually magnetic. You see, it's made of this plasma material, and deep down in the center of the core, due to really complicated interactions, it actually causes magnetism, these magnetic loops, to kind of breach their way to the surface of the sun, where they come up in one of these loops and then they loop back down. It's telling us that the sun is very, very active, has these big magnetic bands that are essentially everywhere on the sun. Now, when we look at the sun, we don't see a picture like this. This was used, there's special imaging for this. What we see them revealed as is sunspots. So one of these magnetic bands would come out of this dark hole and then it would enter over here. Those are the big magnetic bands that exit the sun and then kind of loop back down and make a U shape. So why did I spend all that time talking about magnetic Earth and sunspots and magnetic loops? Well, it tells us that the sun is really active. And what happens sometimes is when these magnetic bands become too concentrated, and as the sun is spinning, these magnetic bands actually get really tangled and really stressed and really pulled up until the point where the magnetic bands can actually snap and explode. It's like a rubber band that's been pulled too far and it snaps and it releases all that energy. And if you want to know the scientific term, it's called a coronal mass ejection. But for the purpose of this talk, we can just think of it as a big explosion that comes off of the sun. We can see it emanating in these pictures, and it actually releases material from the sun, flinging it out into space. Okay, so again, these eruptions actually release material from the sun, flinging it out into space. And it can do this in any direction. And what that means for us is sometimes little old tiny Earth over here happens to be in the way of one of these giant explosions. And you might be scared for your life first time hearing that. But if you remember from about 1 minute ago, I mentioned Earth has a magnetic field. And I am so thankful that we have one of these. What ends up happening is as the material blasts towards the Earth, it gets deflected by the magnetic field and kind of goes backwards along this end of the magnetic field, and then it gets sucked back in along the magnetic line, and it gets funneled into two areas. It gets funneled into the North Pole, and it gets funneled into the South Pole. And when that material from the sun enters the Earth, it reaches the final step to finally create the northern lights. It bumps into molecules in our atmosphere. So the material from the sun will bump into oxygen, it'll bump into nitrogen, it will excite that material, and it will flash brilliant colors of northern lights. Wow, that was a lot of information, huh? A quick recap of that. The sun blasts stuff at the Earth, Earth deflects it with the magnetic field, it gets vacuumed back down into Earth and bumps into molecules in our atmosphere. And just as a quick little side note, you might be wondering, do other planets have northern lights if they have those three things interacting? And the answer is yes. Here are some pictures of Saturn and Jupiter with northern lights. How cool is that? All right, let's talk a little bit about the colors of the northern lights, because as we can see in this picture, there are many different types of colors. I'll tell you that the colors come from two things. It comes from the type of molecule being interacted with, and it has to do with the elevation in which that molecule exists. So remember, our atmosphere is made of nitrogen and oxygen, and they can exist at different elevations. That's what will give you the different colors of the northern lights. So what I have here is we have a column showing elevation in both kilometers and miles. We see that clouds usually taper out around 10 kilometers or right below that. But if we work our way higher up, we're going to see where the northern lights exist. Here at 80 to 100 kilometers, we have the lowest edge of the northern lights. This is when nitrogen in our atmosphere at this elevation interacts with material coming from the sun. When they interact, it excites it and it flashes blue and purple. Working our way higher up the column, up to 200 kilometers, we have the material from the sun interacting with oxygen. When that happens, it begins to flash green, which is perhaps the most common color that you'll see of the northern lights. and finally working our way up all the way to the top at 250 kilometers, we have the material bumping into oxygen, but at that higher elevation. When that happens, it begins to flash red. And so it's cool when you're looking at the northern lights, you're seeing this kind of 3D painting that reveals to us both the material in our atmosphere, but also the elevations in which they exist. Okay, so you might have heard that next year is a really good time to see the northern lights. So we're going to quickly discuss why you should try to go see them on your own next year. And the reason for that is that the sun goes through something known as a solar cycle. It exists every 11 years. That's what's being displayed on this bottom row over here, this bottom axis. And it goes through a period of time in that 11 years where it's very inactive and where it is very active. And what I mean by active, we've already discussed the presence of sunspots and those big explosions coming off of the sun. Well, as it turns out, the pattern that we see with this 11-year solar cycle is that at the beginning of a cycle, it's the most inactive, while around the middle of the cycle is the most active. Now, this graph stops at about 2020, really ended around 2019. And so, actually, what that puts us right now in the upcoming year, that puts us around the middle of the solar cycle, which is again the time where the sun is the most active. You'll see the most sunspots, the most explosions coming off the sun, and therefore the most northern lights. So I hope this inspires you to really give it a shot next year. And if you want some tips on how to put it all together, you learned about what they are, how they form, but now you want to go see them next year. I've just created this very simple 3-point checklist, which we can see here. There's a high rating on an app or a website. The location is very far north or very far south, and there's nothing in the night sky that would block you from seeing it. If you check all 3 of those off, you're in pretty good hands. So the first one just means check. Yeah, there's like a million different apps you can find. If you just type in Aurora borealis or northern lights in your phone, any one of these will come up. And they have different forecasts. Sometimes it's a 27-day forecast where it tells you which day is a low rating, which one's a medium rating, and which one is a high rating. So this is one example of a type of forecast you may look at. But check this out. I got this picture literally this morning. I added this to the slide. This was the forecast, the 3-day forecast, and it shows you physically where the northern lights are predicted to be. And check this out. This is Minnesota. We see northern Minnesota up here, and that's where Voyageurs National Park is. If you're up in the area, give it a shot. It looks like there's some good odds of you seeing them. The second thing you need to check off is you need to go to a high elevation. And what I mean by that, not high elevation, high latitude. And what I mean by that is you have to go higher up north on the globe or higher south on the globe. And so if you remember, these are called lines of latitude. They go in increments of 30 away from the equator. And what you want to do is try to go up for the higher numbers, whether it's north, in which case you call them the northern lights, or south, in which case you call them the southern lights. Now, what I would consider high elevation would be anywhere near 60, even around 40. That's a pretty good chance that you'll see them. And the last thing we talked about, which is there's nothing obstructing your view, whether that's from clouds, which again exist at lower elevations, or whether it's from light pollution, which is the invasion of night skies by artificial light. Sometimes you could be standing there and there could be northern lights dancing above your head, but if there's clouds in the way or if there's too much light, it'll block it out and you'll never even know it. So if you want to see the northern lights, say, get out of here, clouds, get out of here, light pollution. You'll really up your odds. And the last thing I want to say on this section is that this is how to increase your chances of seeing them, but of course it's no guarantee. I've gone out on nights where it's a high rating and I was hopeful and I looked up for hours and I never saw it. And I've been out on nights where it's a low rating and I just happen to be out. And I was met with this wonderful green color that filled the sky. So a lot of it is up to chance as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is this thing known as night sky preservation. So Voyagers Conservancy, the organization in which I work for, takes this really seriously. We're really serious about fighting light pollution and educating about it. If you're unaware, light pollution is the invasion of night skies by artificial light. So that's what we're seeing in this map of the US, all the light pollution. And if you didn't ever hear about this before, you might be saying, how can light be a pollution? I use light every day and I'm okay. And light on its own is not a bad thing, but what we're seeing is excessive amounts of light all the time. It's actually a really harmful thing. We're seeing it affect a wild array of animals and ecosystems, particularly nocturnal animals. It's bad for human health. For one, it's just straight up wasteful. And it also erases the night sky. It erases our cultural and historical ties to the night sky and just our opportunity to look up and be curious and connected with the cosmos. And we can see that light pollution is not just an issue in the United States. If we zoom out, we can see it's an issue in many parts of the globe. And so, what can be done to combat light pollution? Luckily, there are organizations out there such as the International Dark Sky Association, the IDA, that's kind of at the forefront of combating light pollution. And what that means is that they work with different areas of land to make them more dark sky friendly. And once they have kind of proven themselves worthy, they have undergone all the steps necessary, they are given a certificate that says that they are stewards of the night. And so, what does it mean to get one of these certifications? Well, thankfully, after a lot of hard work, Voyagers National Park received our certification just a few years ago. And part of what that entails, there are two big things. One, you have to take an actual quantitative measurement of darkness. So you take this little device and you press it up at the sky, and it gives you a number that represents darkness. So if you take it in a really bright place and you take the measurement in a really dark place, you'll see two opposite ends of the spectrum. And the other thing is you have to do an educational component. And that's where I come in. I show people the wonders of the night sky, both through telescopes and constellation tours, but also to teach about light pollution, the adverse effects, and what you can personally do to combat it. And the last thing I'll mention about that is it is truly the International Dark Sky Association. And so there are places that are certified all throughout the globe. And if you want to become, if you're interested in this cause and you want to get involved, you can check out the International Dark Sky Association website and find your local chapter to see how you can get involved. That was a lot of information. I hope that you understand the Northern Lights at a deeper level. I like to kind of quickly recap it just to get it all out there. First thing we talked about is what are the Northern Lights? We learned that it's a brilliant display of colors and forms that shoot across the night sky. We learned that they form after the sun blasts material, which is deflected by the Earth's magnetic field, sucked in, where it interacts with molecules in our atmosphere. We learned that the colors of the Northern Lights are dependent upon the type of molecule being interacted with and the elevation in which it exists. We learned that next year is a really good year to give it a shot to go see the Northern Lights, as we are in the maximum period, the solar maximum, which is the time where the sun is most active. We learned some tips and tricks for seeing them on your own, including looking at an app, getting as far away from the equator as possible, and making sure there's nothing in the night sky blocking you. And lastly, we talked about night sky preservation, what light pollution is, how to combat it, and a little bit about the International Dark Sky Association. I want to thank you all so much for joining me in this presentation. Uh, Voyagers Conservancy is the place to check out if you're interested in knowing what is going on in the park, if you want to support the park at all, or if you want to donate. With that, I'll say thank you again, and please email me, ask questions at the end of this presentation. I'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Awesome, Jesse. Thank you for sharing that. Travis, will you pull your presentation up? And we're going to talk a little bit on the photography side of it. I'm excited for that too. And one question for you, like there's several questions in here, but I'm going to ask you one while Travis is working to pull his presentation up. Mary asked, what does KP stand for, and what's the threshold that we should be looking for?
Oh man, I forget that off the top of my head. KP index, I think it's named after the guy. That's I'll have to check that. But it's based on, I believe, so there's several different types of forecasts. I forget which one is which, but one of them, as we saw, is a 27-day forecast, and that's based on the amount of time that the sun takes to rotate on its axis. It takes about 27 days, which is why we can predict 27 days out. Then there's like 3-day forecast, and there's like even I think a 1 hour forecast, which is based on satellites. And so it's based on the activity of the sun. That is how many sunspots we see and other measurements of how active it is. It's a great question.
Awesome. We'll get to more of your questions later. Travis, your
Great.
presentation looks great. I'll let you take it away.
All right. So while you guys were chatting there, I looked up KP index, and I am not a German speaker, but I guess it's originates from German for Planetarische Kennziffer, which is German for planetary index.
I'm glad I didn't know that because I would have
So
disembarrassed
I didn't
myself
know that
trying to
either.
pronounce that.
I probably looked that up years ago and forgot it, but
Doesn't roll off the tongue, that's for sure.
not really, not for me.
Yeah, it doesn't.
But thanks, Jesse, for that that presentation. A lot of great info there. And thanks to Benji Cohn and Jeff Letterman for asking me to participate in this webinar today. So I did introduce myself earlier in Ojibwe Moin, which is the native language, the language of the Ojibwe people, which I am a member of. And for those of you that may not know, Grand Portage is an Indian reservation at the very northeast tip of Minnesota. It's bordered by Lake Superior to the east and south, Ontario, Canada to the north, and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area and Superior National Forest to the west. And this area is home to some of the most dramatic terrain that Minnesota has to offer. We've got rugged mountains, beautiful inland lakes, wild rivers, dense forests, and some of the darkest night skies to be found anywhere. And I am going to talk about what it's like, for me at least, from my perspective, to photograph the Northern Lights, less so from a technical perspective and more from just a general approach perspective. But I am, as I mentioned, I'm a proud citizen and lifelong resident of the Grand Portage Anishinaabe Nation. And I've been photographing the woods and waters of the Lake Superior region for around 25 years. I am a self-taught nature and wildlife photographer, and my photography does focus mainly on my native homelands. I've also traveled pretty extensively throughout the West, the Southwest, and Alaska, but I'm always drawn back to the beauty that we have here in what I often like to say or refer to as this most unique of places, that is Minnesota. And one of the reasons that I love our state so much is because it is, of course, my ancestral homeland, with my family history going back probably farther than I even realized, but also because it is kind of this oasis of darkness. And I've experienced the night sky in more places than I can count now around the world, but in my opinion, none of those places compares to the quality of the night sky that's available to us here. And I have loved that night sky for as long as I can remember. From nights spent with my dad while he was capturing images of the sky on film, to after dark walks with my mom, to moonlight hikes and bike rides. The night sky has always been there, and I've always loved it. Nights spent under the glow of a sky filled with stars and the dancing lights of the Aurora borealis. Those are some of the best memories that I have. And those experiences stick with you and increase your appreciation for the outdoors like few other experiences can. And my approach to photography, it's what I call very much a mindful process, meaning that I put a lot of thought and planning into it. And I like to think of that method not so much as taking pictures, but rather making photographs. Much like other people make their art, I make my art as well. And it is very much a process. The implementation of my photography is very intentional and it takes time. So I spend countless hours in the daylight scouting for possible locations to photograph at night, whether it's hiking or driving around in the state or national forests on some gravel roads, or out canoeing or biking or even skiing or snowshoeing. I'm always on the lookout for potential locations for photographing the night sky. And as an example, like when I find a lake that has an intriguing curve to the shoreline with maybe some nice pine trees or some other foreground element, I'll be looking or kind of paying attention to the direction and thinking ahead. And so in my mind, I'll be trying to visualize what that area might look like at night, whether the Milky Way would line up or whether it would be a good spot for some northern lights or maybe both. Then I'll start to plan for when I might want to go back there at night to try and photograph these things. And in some cases, there are many, many hours, if not days, invested in scouting a location, and sometimes even years will pass before I make it back there to photograph at night. And throughout this planning process, I'm spending time there in these locations at different times of the day and different times of the year. And this time spent there, when you spend more than just a few minutes in a place, it helps create a familiarity and kind of a connection to that place. And I do believe that investing in that process of spending time, it yields stronger photographic compositions and images that draw the viewer in and hopefully make them feel something. Maybe something along the lines of what I felt as I went through the process of making that image a photographic reality. So typically, when I arrive on location, it'll be before it gets dark. I'll get there an hour or two before the sun goes down usually. And just sitting in a spot and watching the light change, that's one of the most magical things I think about being anywhere. You can be in the middle of a city and watch the same thing. You can watch as the light washes over the buildings and the skyline, getting warmer in color as the sun drops closer to the horizon. And as that moment's arriving, when daytime transitions into nighttime and the sunlight's going away, soon to be traded with starlight, in those moments, everything else kind of melts away. I'm there, I'm with the stars, and that's all there is. It's that simple. And so while mindfulness can be practiced pretty much anytime and anywhere, it's moments like those portrayed in this photo that I find the most beneficial. So when I come across a scene like this, yeah, I am taking some time to survey the scene and set up my tripod to make some photographs. But I'm also taking time to just sit there and kind of be with everything around me. So once my tripod and camera are set up, I'll typically sit or lay on the ground for several minutes and just kind of listen to what's going on around me. On this particular night, Lake Superior was incredibly calm, and the only sounds that it made came from the lapping of the smallest of waves on the shoreline. And as I sat there taking in this amazing view, I could hear a few frogs croaking from the wetland behind me. And I also heard the repetitive, almost mechanical sound of a beaver chewing on a piece of wood. I could feel the light touch of mosquitoes as they danced across the surface of my exposed arms. I also noticed the intoxicating aromas of the forest, the rich scents of pine and spruce, and the intense fragrance of the humidity of the waters that surrounded me. And taking the time to notice each of these things helps you appreciate each of them in their own way. Keeping an open mind and recognizing that each of these elements all have their place and purpose in nature helps me come away with a deeper sense of the necessity of all these things, not just for their place in nature, but also for our own well-being. And this here, this is the same image I have as my background for my virtual background here. It's probably one of my most popular images, definitely one of my most favorite. And when I talk about this one, I like to say this or talk about this theme of water connecting the earth and the sky. And this is often, most evident when you're at an inland lake like this and you see the stars, you see the Milky Way and maybe the Aurora reflecting on the surface of that lake. You're gazing up at that big, beautiful line that is this arc through the sky, that milky band of stars and light, which can seem larger than life. And on those nights, when there is absolutely no wind, you can see this almost perfect reflection, this mirrored image of the sky. And if you're lucky enough to be out on a lake like this on such a night in a canoe or a boat, in a sense, the sky feels like it's both above and below you. It can feel like you're floating out there in the universe, drifting through space rather than across the surface of the lake. And it can be hard to tell which way is up and which way is down. So there's that connection, right? You have the water, which makes its cycle through evaporation. It goes up into the atmosphere, it comes back down as rain. It's all connected, just like everything in life is connected. And being there in those moments and seeing something that's so close to you, showing you right in front of you what you can also see in the sky, it just kind of ties it all together. And it makes you feel insignificant and kind of large all at the same time. And makes you feel part of all that, part of that energy that ties everything together. And I'm also like to talk a little bit about Indigenous connections or cultural connections to the night sky. And Indigenous nations have studied the sky for millennia, and their cosmologies are vast and deep. Teachings about the aurora are often intertwined with teachings about the Milky Way and the night sky. Some of this knowledge is protected. Most of it has not been written down, and much of it has been lost due to colonization. So the connection between the aurora and the dancing spirit lights comes from the Ojibwe phrase, Jibayag Nima Idewag, which refers to the northern lights or aurora borealis. Jibayag translates as ghosts or spirits, and Nima Idewag translates as they dance. Another Ojibwe word for the northern lights is wawate. There is a display of northern lights. And yet another term that can be used, which I just learned fairly recently, and I think is probably my favorite, is called wasanude. And wasa comes from the word wasamoen, which means lightning, or wasesi, which means there is a flash of lightning. And nude comes from the word nuden, which means it is windy, there is a wind, or the wind blows. So wasanude can sort of be translated as a flashing lights wind, which is, kind of literally what the aurora is, in a sense. And this concept of Jibaya Nima Idewag, or spirits dancing, also relates to the Ojibwe teaching about the Milky Way, or Jibai Zibe, the river of souls. As Ojibwe scholar and elder Carl Gaboy explains, when the soul departs, it travels a path to the west. After other trials, the soul comes to a great shining river, one whose reflection can be seen in the night sky, the Milky Way. The Ojibwe understanding of the Milky Way relates to the spirit returning to the stars along the Jibai Zibe. The soul gets in a waiting canoe and paddles the river to the great beyond and greets all the friends and relatives. And when we look up at the night sky and see the northern lights, it's our relatives dancing. Carl also talked about how there's kind of this branch of the Milky Way that forks off and sort of disappears. And if people lived a good and proper life, they would stay on the main path to the afterlife. But if they did not live a good and proper life, they would travel on that other fork and disappear into the cosmos. So clearly, in the Indigenous perception of both the Jibai Zibe and the Jibayag Nime Iriwag, the core understanding is not what can be recorded, but that which is fundamental to human nature, the spiritual journey. Here we see the relationship-based Indigenous connection to the Aurora and the Milky Way. The night sky is not solely an abstract collection of facts that exists externally to be measured, but rather like a close relative who exists nearby and whose influence is vast. And the very name of the state of Minnesota has been appropriated from the Dakota phrase Minnesota Makoche, which translates as the land where the waters reflect the skies or heavens. This idea of reflection and connection to the sky is a fundamental theme of Dakota cosmology. And the Dakota word for this twin relationship or pairing of earth and sky is kapemini. And this single word contains an entire cosmological philosophy. Its usual translation, as it is above, it is below, oversimplifies but speaks directly to this critical Indigenous-based worldview of a mirrored relationship between earth and sky. The 7 council fires, also known as the Sioux Nation, are the people who speak the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota dialects. The 7 groups in the nation are mirrored by the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. And one Dakota translation of Northern Lights is Wanagi Tawachipi, or again, spirits dancing. This perspective relates to the fundamental philosophy of origin: we come from the stars. Lakota spiritual leader Arvel Lookinghorse, while addressing the group Native Skywatchers in 2021, explained, "We came here as a spirit from Star Nation, and when we get done, we go back. The star knowledge is like a mirror. The stars up there, and we have the stars down here. And the connecting bridge between here and the spirit world is the road of the spirits, or the Milky Way." And so for me, even though I grew up on a reservation, Indigenous star knowledge has been hard to come by. There just aren't that many people, at least in my community, that seem to know a whole lot about it. So it's been quite an education and quite an honor for me getting to know Carl Gaboy and Annette Lee of Native Skywatchers, as they have shared some of what they've learned over their lifetimes putting some of these pieces of star knowledge together. And to this day, Carl and Annette both continue to study that connection that Indigenous people have with astronomy and constellations. And they've graciously given me permission to share in my presentation some of the knowledge that I've learned from them. So here we have one of Carl's illustrations of Pegasus constellation, which to Ojibwe was the moose. And, as you might guess, different cultures have different identities for these familiar constellations in the sky, depending on what is important or significant to that culture. And a good example is the Greek constellation Pegasus. But of course, a flying horse doesn't really make sense to the Ojibwe people. A moose makes a lot more sense. And as Carl explains, autumn is the time of the moose. As we all know, that's when they are most active, when they're most aggressive, as they look for a mate. And autumn is also when this constellation can be seen in our sky. And as you can see by the illustration, the great square of Pegasus is what makes up the body of the moose, those 4 stars that make up that square. And in the next slide, you can see one of my photographs where the body of the moose constellation is in the upper right half of the sky. And it's tilted. It's more like the moose would be looking upwards instead of, straight horizontally. But on the top right of the image, you can see those 4 stars that make up the body of the moose. And if you look to the left, kind of right at the top of the highest part of the trees, there's a smudgy spot, kind of looks like a planet or a large star with a smear around it. That's actually the Andromeda galaxy. And then to the left, above the trees, you can see 5 stars that make up what looks like the shape of a W, which would be Cassiopeia. In another one of Carl's illustrations, to the Ojibwe, the constellation Orion is known as the Winter Maker and is the most noticeable constellation in our winter sky. And Carl has explained that some of the figures represented in constellations are at the height of their power when they appear highest in the sky. And Winter Maker is a good example of that. As we progress through autumn, late in the night, just a few hours before sunrise, Winter Maker can be seen rising above the horizon. And during the deepest, darkest, coldest depths of our winter, this constellation is very prominent in the sky. Then, as spring slowly arrives, Winter Maker drops below the horizon, not to be seen again until fall. And here is a photograph I made of Winter Maker Orion rising over Pigeon Point in Grand Portage at about 3:30 in the morning on September 4th. And I was out there for a couple hours, and it took a long time for the whole constellation to finally get above the trees on the point there. It was getting, to be definitely closer to sunrise than not. But here you can see first at the beginning of the new year, not long after dark, Orion is already up there in the sky, and by middle of the night, he gets fairly high in the sky. And a constellation that's visible to us in the summer is Nanabuju, or Scorpio. Nanabuju is a prominent figure in Ojibwe culture, and as Carl describes, he is a very complicated Ojibwe character with many different aspects to him, both good and bad. And there are more tales told about him than any other character in Ojibwe history. In general, he's portrayed as the model for many cultural values and norms, and is thought to be the one who is responsible for the way things are in the world. To quote Carl, often a trickster and sometimes the tricked, often the philosopher, sometimes the debunker of philosophy, often the teacher, sometimes the recalcitrant student. He is pictured as a giant and as a normal person, and can often take the form of an animal. He is simultaneously the twin brother of the wolf and the only child of a mortal woman and spirit father. In short, he is the embodiment of all the qualities found in the catalog of Greek, Roman, Norse, and any other gods of the many human cultures. Yet he is distinctly Ojibwe, for he is the embodiment of the people. And if you look at the 3 stars that make Nanabuju's bow, that for me is the easiest part of that constellation to find in our summer sky. So just above and to the right of this little island, you can see those 3 stars that make up the bow, kind of arcing in an arc to the right. And there's other interesting things going on here. People often think that's the moon on the left, but it's not. It's actually Mars. And then way on the right, there's another bright object reflecting in the water, and that's Jupiter. And somewhere in the middle of the bright part of the Milky Way, Saturn is in there too. So we've got 3 planets easily visible. Saturn, you would probably need binoculars to find. But that was July 2018, kind of a cool conjunction we had for most of that summer. So one last constellation before I wrap up that I want to talk about is one that we are almost all certainly familiar with, and that is the Fisher, as it's known to the Ojibwe, but most probably know him as Ursa Major, the Great Bear, or more commonly, the Big Dipper. And Fishers are, I think, pretty amazing creatures. They've got incredible agility and prowess. And I've seen them move through the forest as if the forest isn't even there. I've seen them climb trees more easily and silently than you can even imagine. And while I have seen them now and then over the years, this photograph is the only good photo that I've ever made of them. They're really elusive and hard to capture in a photo. And there's a story about how Fisher earned his place in the night sky. A story about a very long winter that would not end. Fisher and his friends realized that if the winter did not end, they would have nothing to eat and would starve. They realized that something had happened in the sky world to stop the seasons from turning as they should. Wolverine went to the sky world by way of a great pine tree. From the top of the tree, it was but a short step to an opening in the sky. He discovered that a great ogre beyond the edge of the sky had captured all the birds in giant birch bark baskets, and that's why winter was not ending. He came back to tell his friends, and they decided that they needed to free the birds in order for winter to end. Fisher was chosen to go due to his speed and agility. So he ascended the great pine tree and faced the ogre and his brothers. Realizing that quickness was his only chance, he dashed between their legs and ran to the baskets to free the birds. Out poured the birds, and up they spiraled in a great black cloud that darkened the sky. Then, in a tornado of wings, they plunged down through the hole in the sky and entered the world below. The ogre shouted in rage and ran toward the brave little Fisher. Once again, Fisher used his quickness to dodge their attacks, and when he reached the great hole in the sky, he threw himself through it. Far below, he could see the earth, and before his eyes, it was turning white to brown to green. Down he fell, the ogre's arrows whizzing all around him. None of the arrows found its mark, and he landed on soft, mossy ground. The ogres followed him down, and Fisher continued to dodge their attacks. But try as he might, he couldn't lose them. In desperation, he raced back to the great pine tree, thinking he could fool them by climbing into the sky world, then doubling back down. Quickly, he climbed the tree, but he was not fast enough. The ogres saw him, and a great volley of arrows whizzed by, missing him by inches. At the top of the pine tree, Fisher leapt to the north, and here one of the arrows found its mark and pinned him to the sky by his tail. And around he turned, and there he is to this very day. So with the freeing of the birds, the ogres lost their power over Earth, and they left by way of the great pine tree back through the hole in the sky to their world. And in this photo, which is from July 2020, we can see in the top left, Fisher, the Ursa Major, Big Dipper. Right below that is Comet Neowise, which was visible for a good chunk of that summer. And then on the right side, you can see another line kind of streaking up to the right, which is a Perseid meteor. And while the Fisher story may seem like a sad story, it is in fact a story of bravery and courage and their rewards. For Fisher did not die. Each year he circles the heavens. In winter he crawls along the northern horizon, but in spring he gains power and ascends overhead. As he reaches the zenith, the birds come and summer is restored to the land. Then slowly he swings back to the west toward the horizon, and it's time for the birds to leave. So it is Fisher in gaining power who heralds the coming of the birds, and when he loses power, He's the messenger that tells them it's time to go. So for millennia, humans have gazed at the night sky in awe and wonder. Western science provides fascinating insights into the physics of what we witness. Indigenous knowledge asserts powerful human connections to the stars and the northern lights. And our own quiet observation strengthens and deepens our relationship to the sky. With careful attention, we can feel our connection to generations past who have shared these emotions and curiosity. And we can recognize our connection to future generations and our responsibility for preserving this experience for them. Miigwech, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Travis. It was great to have both of you on here. It's just fantastic to have the two perspectives, the science part behind it and the native perspective you provided, Travis. It's just awesome. And the photography is pretty darn good too. So
Thanks.
thank you both for joining us today. And I know we are almost out of time. We'll go a little bit long today if we can hang on and do that. Much appreciate everybody that joined us. We had a record number of attendance. I saw over 400 people in attendance today, which is awesome. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in the Northern Lights, and we'll get this posted as soon as we can for people that weren't able to join us today. So we asked Mary's question a little bit earlier about the KP and what the threshold was, and it's the higher number of the KP value is what we're looking for. I'm not for sure if there's like a threshold of this is where we get up and go outside or not. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that real quick or.
Yeah, I believe the number, if it's above a KP4, actually I can check my slide. Yeah, I think a KP4, maybe like 5 is medium, and then above that is a high rating. So actually, yeah,
Awesome.
below a 4 is low, a 4 is medium, and above a 4 is considered high, and it goes up to 9.
Yeah, and I would, concur with that and say that after as many years as I've been watching and photographing, it has to get like 5 or above for me to want to go out and look. We can often see a really nice glow on the horizon when it's at 4 or even 3 sometimes, if you're up in northern Minnesota. But to get the really good stuff, it's got to be 5 or above.
Great. Julie had a question for you, Jesse, on the instrument you showed to measure the darkness. She was wondering what the name of that instrument was.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's called a sky quality meter, or SQM for short. And yeah, so it takes an actual quantitative measurement of darkness. As far as how it's actually calculated, it's kind of above me. But the takeaway is that if you were to take that measurement in the Twin Cities and then take it up at like Voyagers or Boundary Waters, you'd see two opposite ends of the spectrum of that number, one showing a very bright place and one the absence of brightness. So sky quality meter.
Great. I know we have a lot of educators that join the program, so maybe that's a future education topic for her class. So.
Oh, absolutely. Great.
Sharon had a question for you, Travis. You might be best to answer this one. And I've noticed it too. Is it best to use a cell phone to determine if the northern lights aren't so evident and they make the sky brighter? I've seen the northern lights and I've taken a picture with my cell phone and more of these colors pop. So should talk about that real quick.
Sure. So there is, your most phones, I think, are going to automatically set the exposure for you. Some phones do have exposure settings within their phone or their camera controls within the phone. But that's a common question I get is, these photos I see, like they never look like that to the naked eye. And my common answer to that is because and same thing with the Milky Way, like the Milky Way doesn't look as bright, as vivid as it does in your photographs. And I think the main reason for that is our eyes are only seeing the light and color that's there in that instant, for that split second that we're viewing it. And the camera, like most of the Milky Way shots that I take are half a minute long, and they're taken at really high ISO settings, and the lens aperture opening is open as wide as it'll go, so it's letting as much light in as possible. And I often say, like, if we could think of our eyes as cameras and we close our eyes, we open them and hold them open for 30 seconds, and we're collecting all that light into our eyes for 30 seconds, and then we close our eyes and see an image, it's going to look somewhat similar to what a photo would look like, because now we're seeing 30 seconds of accumulated light versus an instant. And so when you collect that light over time, it makes everything brighter and it makes the colors more apparent too. And that's something our eyes just can't see as well as a camera can.
That was a great explanation. Thank you. I'll let both of you just, if you want to throw out one app. Abby asked a question about which forecast app would you recommend in someone starting out. We put a bunch of that stuff in the chat, so please check the chat for those of you that are going to see this recording. Do each of you want to give maybe your favorite app to use for seeing the Northern Lights maybe tonight?
Well, I don't use an app, but I do have spaceweather.com bookmarked on my browser on my phone. And I check that website at least once a day, sometimes twice a day. And it'll usually tell us sometimes 3 or 4 days ahead of time when we might expect to see a Northern Lights event. So I think that event there tonight is actually a good possibility, as Jesse mentioned earlier. And I think they started talking about that 2 days ago on spaceweather.com. So it does give you a little bit of advance warning, so you can kind of plan your sleep schedule, get some extra sleep ahead of that night.
Space weather. Jesse, do you have an app that you use, or?
Yeah, I like space weather. The one I have on my phone is just called Aurora. It's pretty good. It gives you notifications when it's actually happening outside, because you set your location. I also use one from a website from the Geophysical Institute of Fairbanks, Alaska, and they have a 27-day forecast that I'll kind of just get like the general feel for it, and then for more specifics, there's options on that website to see like a 3-day or 1-day forecast.
Travis, I got one for you. You got a fan out there in Chris. He mentioned, talking about your book, you mentioned the sound of the Aurora Borealis. Can you share some more information about that so we know what to listen for?
Sure, and I will put a disclaimer out there that I can't with any certainty say that I have ever for sure heard the Aurora. I've suspected that maybe my ears have picked up a little something, but it is scientifically proven now. There was I think the guy's name was Unto Laine from Finland that finally recorded over 90 different sounds using really sensitive audio recording equipment. So he did definitively prove that there are sounds associated, and it has to do with like the warm and cold layers. This inversion layer in the atmosphere is where those sounds are made. When you've got, as Jesse mentioned, all this energy coming in, and it's like releasing in different forms. One of the ways it releases is light. Another way it releases is an audio component. And I guess the most common noises are like just kind of a crackling, almost like radio static, I guess. And then another common one would be a soft shushing or whooshing of like what sounds like silk sheets kind of rubbing together.
It's pretty amazing. I've never heard the Northern Lights, but they have something to look forward to this year. So, Mary had a question. Oh, I just jumped around there a little bit. Caroline, hi. From Maine, joining us today. Mary was asking Travis, I think it was actually Jesse that maybe spoke about the importance of latitude, seeing the Northern Lights. What about simple elevation? For example, a place Mary would like to see the Northern Lights is by her lake, but she's in a bit of a valley. How important would that be to get out of the valley? And it kind of depends on where you're located, correct?
Definitely affects it. Yeah, like Jesse said, like you don't want to have anything obstructing your view of the sky. So I usually tell people for Northern Lights, get on the south side of a lake or the south side of a field or meadow, someplace flat. Like a valley is not a good place, but if she was able to get up on a hill on the edge of that valley looking to the north, then even if there's a low glow on the horizon, you'd be able to see it. But if you're down in that valley, the hill would block the view of it.
Kelly had another photography question. When photographing the active aurora, how do you set your camera settings in order to get no noise? When I set on a high ISO, get around 10-second shutter speed, it's just too much noise in the background. I'm
It's
sure we get a ton of camera questions, Travis, but we'll get a few of them in here.
Yeah, it's going to be, you get a lot more noise when you're shooting the Milky Way because those nights are a lot darker and you have to boost your ISO really high to capture the Milky Way. But with Aurora, you don't have to have the ISO as high. Some of the photos I showed, like my ISO was at 400 or 800, and sometimes 5 seconds to 10 seconds long exposure instead of 30. So that does minimize the noise, but it's going to depend on your lens. Um, a lens that can open the aperture to f2.8 or even 1.8 would be ideal, because then you can shoot with lower ISO and shorter shutter speeds. But also the type of camera you have. Camera with a full frame sensor is going to be best because that gives you the largest physical size sensor. The pixels are bigger on full frame sensors than they are on other cameras, so those pixels gather light more efficiently. Um, Consequently, they're also the most expensive cameras. But yeah, that's what you might be running into if you're getting a lot of noise is you might have a camera that has a sensor that's smaller physically and just doesn't gather the light as efficiently as a full frame.
I know we had a couple of questions in here asking about the type of camera you use, what you recommend. There's 100 options out there for everything from a cell phone to a high-end
Yeah, and
SLR
everybody makes
camera.
good
So
cameras nowadays. I've used 3 different brands over the years to capture northern lights, and it's more what I mentioned just a second ago is if you can afford a full frame camera, get one of those and then buy the best lens that you can afford. By best, I mean um, lowest aperture number. F2.8 lenses are not cheap, but they're worth it when it comes to photographing this stuff. But really, like Canon, Nikon, Sony, they all make great cameras. They all capture it just as well. As long as you buy, you don't buy the bargain basement model. Yeah.
Renee had a question, Jesse, this one might be for you. The BZ, I'm not for sure what the BZ is, but it needs to be low with a high KP is one of the comments she threw in here. I don't know if you want to explain that a little bit or.
Yeah, I know it's another kind of measurement, another way you can determine the northern lights. I don't really know what it is or what it stands for. Um, yeah, Travis, if you
Yeah.
know, you take a shot at it.
Well,
But
I just pulled up one of the links I shared with you, Benji, was Aurora Soft Serve News.
Mhm.
And the BZ, as defined by that website, is the solar wind's magnetic orientation in the up-down direction. And this website says, although auroras can happen with a positive BZ, a negative BZ is generally better because that helps the solar wind grab the Earth's magnetic field more easily. So, in short, negative
Okay.
BZ is good, and the more negative, the better.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like Jesse's picture there, where that corneal eruption happens in relation to where the Earth is, I suppose, to catch the winds just right.
Yeah.
So Selena was asking, does time of night play a role when you'd be more likely to see the northern lights?
I say typically no. Would you agree, Jesse?
yeah, I mean, I've seen them. This is anecdotal, but I've seen them I've seen them quite early, and then I've seen them at like 4 in the morning. So um, yeah, I don't think it has an impact.
It plays into another top 10 question that I get is what's the best season for the Northern Lights, in terms of our Earth-based seasons? And those two really aren't tied together really at all. There is some data out there that indicates around the equinoxes, we're more likely to get auroras given favorable solar conditions. And that's due to the way Earth is tipped at that time of year. But we're just as likely to see them in July as we are December, at least in our latitude. Again, the further north you get is generally speaking better unless it's summertime. Because when you get far enough north in the summer, it doesn't get dark. So of course you're not going to see northern lights, whereas here in Minnesota, we do still have some darkness. So at our latitude, we have more of a chance of seeing summer aurora storms than people in far northern Canada or northern Alaska do, just because they don't have the darkness.
Interesting. Yeah, two more questions for us here. Trudy was wondering, for Travis, have you ever written books or know of any books that are written for kids to share stories like you were sharing about the constellations and stuff?
Well, the only book I'm familiar with, and this is through my learning from Carl, is Carl's book called Talking Sky. And he talks about these constellation stories in there, but it's not a children's book really. I'm not aware offhand of any children's books that talk about it. And again, it goes back to some of this goes back to a lot of this knowledge, being protected, and within the culture is even only shared during certain times of the year. Like wintertime would be a storytelling time, where summertime is not. So that's probably why we don't see more books about it. But Carl's is a good one to look for. I think it's out of print. You can only get it as an ebook right now through Amazon, but it's called Talking Sky by Carl Gawboy.
Okay.
Travis, Keepers of the Earth series, is that something that is recommended through your culture groups?
I've heard of those, but I'm not super familiar with them, so I couldn't say offhand.
Okay.
I was just going to bring that up, Jeff. There was one, I think there was one about the night sky in that Keeper series, but
yeah, I'm pretty sure.
There is one called Keepers of the Night, yeah, but I haven't read it, so I don't know the content.
And then our last question here, Alice asks, what was it like seeing the lights for the first time? I remember seeing the lights when I was a kid for the first time. My most memorable time currently was up in Alaska, in McGrath, Alaska, seeing the northern lights in a really cold night and just being, it wasn't cold at all, just standing there just watching, like, oh my goodness. It was just incredible to see that. Do each of you want to just take a quick few second stab on what your first impression of seeing the northern lights for the first time is? And it's pretty cool.
Yeah, sure. My first time was last year, and it was after one of my night sky programs, actually. So I just finished doing a constellation program and telescopes, and I'd read that the forecast was high that night. And so when we first saw them, they kind of appeared as like a hazy white material. It wasn't like the blatant green that we associate with northern lights, but it was kind of moving in a way that I wasn't familiar with. And I've watched the night sky for so long now. And I was like, I don't know if that's it. And a bunch of visitors there, it was also their first time. And I happened to have my camera with me. And so I went into manual and I messed with the settings. And sure enough, when I took the long exposure, it came back green. And we all got super excited. We all probably stayed there together for like literally probably like another hour to hour and a half. And it only got better throughout the night. It was kind of just a still, stagnant, barely moving white wispy cloud to then just shooting across the sky. And we all just stood there in amazement for the next hour to hour and a half. It's a really beautiful moment.
Isn't that something, how it looks like kind of white or off gray, but then you take that picture and wow, look how green it is.
Yeah, definitive.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
So I can't describe my first time as vividly as Jesse, because mine was probably when I was about 5 years old. I mentioned earlier, I think that I used to go out shooting, or my dad used to go out shooting a lot with film cameras back in the like early 80s through the late 90s. And my first time seeing the aurora is, I was so young, I don't really remember it. But I remember seeing the aurora a lot as I was growing up, because I did spend a lot of time outdoors at night with him. But one thing I will say is that it's certainly, no matter how many times you've seen it, especially, yeah, that glow that kind of hangs there on the horizon and doesn't really move that often gets confused for the glow of city lights. That can be kind of ho hum, I guess you might say. But when you get these events where the sky just erupts and you've got ribbons of light and pillars shooting upwards and funnel clouds that just kind of wave around, it's that kind of stuff you never get tired of. And every time you see it, it's just as cool as the last time. And you kind of stand there dumbfounded, like, am I really seeing this? Is this really happening? Whether it's your first time or your 500th time, I think it's the same, to an extent, the same feeling. You just never get tired of it.
Also, I suppose it's kind of like snowflakes. No two shows are identical, so
Yeah,
it's something new every time.
yeah.
And Alice, you asked one last question in here. Can you see something similar to the Northern Lights in the Southern Hemisphere? And yes, you can. You can see them there also. So I think with that, we are way over time. I really appreciate you guys hanging out a little extra long with us here and
Yeah, no
answering
problem.
questions and all that. So I'd like to welcome everybody to join us next week. We're talking a little bit related to this. Instead of just the Northern Lights, we're going to be talking about stories in the snow. So while you're out there waiting for the Northern Lights to appear, there's all kinds of really cool stories you can learn by looking at tracks in the snow and whatnot. So join us next week for our 145th episode of Stories in the Snow. Thanks again, everybody. Everybody have good luck out there tonight if you're looking for the Northern Lights, and stay safe on the ice if you have ice where you are. So thank you very much, and we'll see everybody soon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Take care.
In my phone, I had my phone, I thought, on silence, and my iPad went off. I don't know if you guys could hear that right at the end there, but
No.
And
No, didn't hear it.
we had like
good.
450 at one point there.
Yeah, great job, guys. A lot of exciting interest, that's for sure.
And
Fantastic.
I appreciate you guys letting it run longer, because I really couldn't make what I wanted to share any shorter. So I appreciate